This podcast assumes that you have a general knowledge of the Tate LaBianca murders. Sharon Tate Polanski, Jay Sebring, Wojciech Frykowski, Abigail Folger, and Stephen Parent were murdered on Cielo Drive in Los Angeles on August 9, 1969. Lena and Rosemary LaBianca were slain in their Los Feliz residence the following night. Charles Manson, Charles Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten were convicted of those murders. Say hello to the Goodbye Helter Skelter podcast. Hi, I'm George Stimson. Welcome to the Goodbye Helter Skelter podcast, episode number 29. In this episode, I want to look at the early testimonies of Susan Atkins and see how much of that testimony can be verified by the physical evidence found at the crime scene at 10,050 Cielo Drive. The early testimonies of Susan Atkins are derived from two sources: the December 1, 1969 interview of Atkins by attorneys Paul Caruso and Richard Caballero, and the better-known grand jury testimony of December 5th. These two versions of the crime are the template version of the murders of Sharon Tate Polanski, Jay Sebring, Wojciech Frykowski, Abigail Folger, and Stephen Parent. This version of the crimes has since been echoed by all of the other participants in the crime, from Linda Kasabian during the murder trial, to Charles Watson in his book Will You Die for Me, to Patricia Krenwinkel at her parole hearings, not to mention by just about every other book on the crimes that has ever recounted the murders. But is it what really happened? Is Susan Atkins' testimony accurate? Or was she coached by certain members of the legal and law enforcement professions to give an accounting of the crime that jibed with what they wanted the public to think? In other words, was Susan Atkins' testimony a fabrication that was part of a conspiracy to cover up what really happened and why at Cielo Drive on the night of August 8, 1969? Let's take a look at that testimony and see if we can find out. For the purposes of this examination, I will only look at the physical evidence available from the crime scene at Cielo Drive, and I will not consider any later statements by any individuals such as Kasabian, Watson, or Krenwinkel as corroboration of anything Atkins testified to. We'll start with the interview Atkins gave to attorneys Caruso and Caballero on December 1, 1969. In recounting the murders on Cielo Drive, the first thing that Susan Atkins says happened when the carload from Spahn's Ranch arrived at Cielo was that Charles Watson climbed up a utility pole and severed some wires leading into the Polanski property. This claim is corroborated by the fact that the wires into the property were indeed cut. But as to when they were cut, we only have Atkins' word. There has been speculation, starting with the original police report, that the wires were cut after the murders occurred. That the wires had been cut was widely reported in the news media, so it's possible that Atkins got her wire-cutting recollection from some news report. It's also possible that she came up with the wire-cut story after prompting by someone in law enforcement. But if the latter was the case, the question would arise of why someone would want her to say that the wires were cut when and how she described. Why would it matter? And if you think that Susan Atkins was coerced or tricked into testifying that the wires were cut before the murders, you must also think, then, that the wires were cut after the murders, not before, because the timing of the cutting is the only thing that can be wrong with Atkins' testimony. But then the big question connected with the wires cut after the murders scenario would be why someone would sever wire communications coming from a residence where everybody was dead. Another issue is logistics. The wires were cut with bolt cutters. Although Manson prosecutor Stephen Kay has repeatedly referred to these cutters as 30-pound bolt cutters, they were likelier 30-inch bolt cutters, which would weigh about 9 pounds. In any case, presuming that the wires were cut with the bolt cutters, if the wires were cut after the murders, it would mean that whoever cut the wires would have had to retrieve the cutters from the car parked at the bottom of the Cielo cul-de-sac and walk back up the gate to cut the wires. unless you posit that the car was instead parked by the gate or even inside of it. Or the killers could have carried the cutters up to the gate and left them near the pole before they entered the property. But then, would Charles Watson have been able to climb the pole starting at the ground level? Whichever of these alternate scenarios might be true, you would still have to answer the question, why would someone want to cut wires so that nobody could call out from a house where everyone had been murdered? There is nothing in the physical evidence of the downed wires that corroborates Atkins' version of that part of the crime, but there is nothing in the evidence that contradicts that version. However, an alternate scenario where the wires were cut after the murders doesn't make sense and is logistically implausible. Therefore, Atkins' recollection of the wire cutting is likely accurate. In the next part of Atkins' narrative, she and her 3 crime partners drive the car down to the bottom of the Cielo cul-de-sac, park it, and walk back up to the gate entrance to 10,050. There is nothing in the evidence to indicate that this didn't happen, and it makes sense that it did, because the top of the Cielo cul-de-sac by the gate is a tight fit and would not be a smart place to leave a vehicle while committing mass murder. In the police report, there was no apparent law enforcement speculation as to where the killer's vehicle was parked. So, is it likely that anyone would have suggested the bottom of the cul-de-sac location to Atkins? Is there a plausible reason for anyone having done so? The practicality of parking the car at the bottom of the cul-de-sac and lack of any reason for anyone to have suggested the location to Atkins mean that this portion of Atkins' testimony is very likely true. After parking the car at the bottom of the cul-de-sac and walking back up the hill, Atkins says that she and her 3 crime partners then entered the property at 10,050 by climbing a hillside to the right of the gate and fence and dropping down to the other side where they were concealed behind some bushes. From there, Charles Watson went on to confront and then murder Stephen Parent in his car at the area of the driveway just past where the inside gate opening button was located. There has been some speculation that this part of Atkins' story is not true, that in fact the 4 killers didn't climb over the embankment, but rather entered the property simply by opening the gate and walking in. But Atkins' version of the entry is likelier true for several reasons. First, there is no way a law enforcement officer could have coached her to claim this means of entry, since no one in law enforcement had even imagined that the killers entered the property by this route. Second, there is no reason for Atkins to have made this up. If she had walked in through the gate, why wouldn't she just say so? Finally, the physical layout of the gate area fits with the description of what Atkins says happened there. There is an area inside the gate on the right-hand side where she and 2 girls could crouch and hide while Watson approached Parent in his car. If she had walked in through the gate, would she have even noticed this area on a dark night when the moon had not yet risen and been able to incorporate it into a concocted story about climbing up the hill and over the fence? Here, the physical layout of the gate area and the lack of any reason for Atkins to be lying corroborates her story about climbing over the fence and hiding in the bushes. Moving along to the next part of the narrative, Charles Watson encounters Stephen Parent and shoots him in his car. In Atkins' testimony, she recalls that Parent was shot 4 times. Atkins specifying the correct number of shots is therefore corroborated by the actual number of wounds Parent suffered. But media reports had it that a witness, Mrs. Cott, heard 3 or 4 shots on the murder night, so it's possible that Atkins got the shot number there, assuming that the notoriously isolated Spahns Ranch had access to multiple news outlets that Atkins could have been exposed to. So that correct fact could have been taken from a media source and corroborates nothing. Incidentally, the first Homicide Investigated Progress report incorrectly states that Parent was shot only 3 times. Such a major error about a fundamental detail of the crime prompts the question of how much else in the report could be wrong. But that's another topic for another podcast. But next, Atkins says that after the shooting, Charles Watson pushed Parent's car back from the gate button area and off to one side, where it was later discovered on the morning of August 9th. There is nothing in the police report of the Cielo Drive killings to suggest that investigating officers had any suspicion or theories about the location and the position of Parent's car. Therefore, no one would have been inclined to prompt Atkins to provide any explanation for why the car was found where it was. Atkins provided a recollection about the car being moved which explained its final position without anyone asking her how it got there, and it is a further example of truthful testimony. The next incident concerning us in Atkins' testimony is her description of how she and her crime partners entered the residence at 10,050 Cielo Drive. According to Atkins, at the house, Charles Watson slid a screen on the window to the right of the front door, climbed in the window, and then went into the foyer, where he opened the front door for his companions. At his murder trial, though, Charles Watson testified that he didn't enter through the window, but instead walked in the front door. But police photographers took pictures of the window with the screen dislodged, as Atkins described, both from inside and outside. But despite that, there is no mention in the police report of the window being a possible means of entry. Nor does it appear from photographs of the open window that the area was dusted for fingerprints. Therefore, one could conclude that the police didn't think the window was a means of entry. And if no one was thinking of the window as a means of entry, it is not likely that anyone would have suggested to Susan Atkins that it was. In addition to that, there was no mention in any media reports of the crime that the window had been cut and that the killers were suspected of having entered through the window. So Atkins couldn't have gotten that part of her story from any news accounts. Therefore, Susan Atkins' account of Charles Watson climbing in the window is not only supported by the evidence of photographs of the cut screen itself, but it is also not something that she could have seen in the news and would not have been suggested to her by law enforcement, who were apparently not even thinking of the window as an entry port. And therefore, Atkins' account is likely true. After entering the house, Atkins describes the action there, rounding up the victims, the chaos that ensued, and the eventual deaths of all persons in the house. Some of these recollections can be compared to evidence. For example, Atkins recalls the positions of the bodies of Sharon Tate Polanski and Jay Sebring as being: Sharon Tate was laying curled up near the couch, and Sebring was coming out this way from the fireplace, and their heads were probably close together. Those were the positions that the bodies were found in the next day, and while it is possible that Atkins could have been shown a photograph of the bodies which stimulated a false or coerced recollection of the position of the bodies when she was at the murder scene, when the bodies were found by police on August 9, they all exhibited signs of livor mortis, or the phenomenon of blood flowing to the lowest part of a dead body once the heart stops beating. Livor mortis commences about 15 minutes after death. Sharon Tate Polanski and Jay Sebring both exhibited characteristics of livor mortis consistent with their bodies not being moved later than 15 or 20 minutes after death. In other words, the time when Atkins would have seen them shortly after their demises. Therefore, Atkins' statement as to the position of the bodies is consistent with evidence, is likely what she saw, and is therefore likely true. Atkins then recalled of the actual murders that, well, as this went on, there was a lot of confusion going on. I don't remember exactly what happened, but I remember seeing Frykowski going outside, and as he was going outside, he was yelling for his life. He was screaming really loud. And I said, "Tex, help me, do something." Tex went over and hit him 5 or 6 times over the head with the butt of a gun, broke the gun handle, the gun wouldn't work anymore, and proceeded to stab him. While he was stabbing, the man was still screaming. I'm surprised nobody heard anything, and he was pretty much half dead on the porch. That's why all the blood was there, I imagine. Frykowski screaming really loud and still screaming is corroborated by the testimony of the campout counselor Tim Ireland at the Westlake School, who heard screaming coming from the direction of the Polanski residence between 12 and 1 a.m. on the night of the murders. Atkins' description of Watson hitting Frykowski over the head with a gun until he broke the gun handle, the gun wouldn't work anymore, is substantiated by the broken bits of the gun handle found near the front door area and by the wounds on Frykowski's head, which were consistent with him having been struck with a gun butt. And, moving back a little, if Watson was correct that the gun wouldn't work anymore after striking Frykowski, then the gun couldn't have been used to shoot Stephen Parent 4 times after the murders of the other 4 persons at Cielo, as alternate versions of his death claim. And now we have reached a very interesting portion of the Caruso Caballero interview, and one which sheds considerable doubt on the contention that Susan Atkins was somehow coerced or coached into making her particular statements, because Atkins not only seems unsure as to whether victim Wojciech Frykowski was shot, but more importantly, she doesn't respond to Attorney Caballero's efforts to make her remember the shooting. In other words, she doesn't respond to his coaching. Caballero: wait a minute, did Frykowski get shot? Atkins: no, not that I know of. Caballero: as he was running out when, Paul, is it your recollection that Frykowski was shot? Caruso: yes. Caballero: as he was running out and you called to Tex, he caught up with him and grabbed him from the back, the back. The gun wasn't loud, as you say, but couldn't Tex have fired once and shot him in the back? Atkins: he may have. Caballero: Frykowski had a bullet hole in his back. Now, would that make sense from the story that you're telling us? Atkins: yes. Caballero: that would not be inconsistent with anything you saw there. Atkins: no, it wouldn't. Caballero: after that shooting is probably when he hit him on the head, because he was shot. Atkins: but I don't remember him being shot. Atkins' insistent lack of memory of Frykowski being shot speaks to the honesty of her recall. Atkins next recalls that Charles Watson stabbed Abigail Folger in the stomach. I think he stabbed her in the stomach because I saw her grab down there. Abigail Folger was stabbed in the stomach. And then Paul Caruso makes the first ever tantalizing mention of the enduring mystery of Wojciech Frykowski's pants, which probably had their own Facebook group by now. Caruso: do you remember where Frykowski's pants were? Did that make an impression on you? Atkins: where his pants were? Caruso: do you recall if his pants were up around his abdomen, or did they fall? Do you recall? Atkins: no, I don't recall. I know they were strange-looking pants. Caballero: what do you mean strange-looking? Atkins: they had some sort of pattern on them. Caruso: were they mod? Atkins: yes, his whole outfit was mod. It looked like an East Indian outfit. Ah, yes, Wojciech Frykowski's pants. It has been suggested by some that since Frykowski's pants were riding rather low on his hips when his body was found, it may be that Charles Watson interrupted his butchery to engage in some buggery in the manner allegedly perpetrated on fleeting Tate murder suspect Billy Doyle shortly before the Cielo homicides. Doyle later couldn't recall whether he'd been tied to a tree, whipped, and sodomized or not. But a likelier explanation is that Frykowski's loose-fitting, pajama-type pants were pulled down as the mortally wounded Pole dragged himself along 30 feet or so of lawn before finally dying. Back in the house, Atkins recalled, so Tex stabbed Sharon Tate Polanski in the heart, and he told us to get out. Sharon Tate Polanski was stabbed in the heart. And then we come to another instance where Atkins doesn't take the bait from Richard Caballero as he tries to get her to confirm that a Buck brand knife found in one of the chairs at the murder scene belonged to the killers. Caballero: things were pretty excited at that point, and you stopped in the car, and as you were late in a few minutes, you wanted to get rid of it. But first of all, there was another knife there that might have been there, a Buck knife too. Do you have knowledge that there was another knife that might have been a Buck knife? Atkins: no, I don't. Caruso: Susan said they all had knives. Caballero: yes, this is crucial because the police have a knife, and that's what we're trying to get to because there's a very good chance that you left a different knife there. Atkins still couldn't recall a Buck brand knife, even though Caballero clearly indicated that he wanted her to. And then finally we get to the last Atkins claim that can be checked against evidence, and it is perhaps the most important one when it comes to determining whether her answers to her lawyer's questions truthfully reflect what happened on the night of August 8, 1969. After leaving Cielo Drive, Atkins recalls something out of order with the accepted narrative of that night, namely that after leaving Cielo Drive, the quartet first drove up onto Mulholland Drive and disposed of weapons and clothing. We'll come back to this time discrepancy later, but it would suffice to say here that Atkins' description of where the clothes were dumped was truthful and accurate enough that a television news crew was able to follow clues in her recollection and recover the clothing. I don't think you could have a better confirmation of the veracity of Atkins' recollection than that. But finally, we get to the final part of Atkins' murder night recall, where she describes an incident on a side street near the murder scene where she and her three crime partners encountered Rudolph Weber while using his garden hose on Portola Drive to clean blood off themselves. This incident was corroborated by Weber himself after he read a version of Atkins' grand jury testimony in the Los Angeles Times on December 14, 1969, and contacted authorities. Weber's recollection of the encounter is practically identical to Atkins, and since no one anywhere was aware of the incident prior to its publication, it is impossible for someone to have suggested it to Atkins as part of her testimony. It has to be true. This concludes the look at Susan Atkins' early testimony given in her lawyer's office on December 1, 1969. 4 days later, on December 5th, she testified at the official grand jury. Her statements to that grand jury make up the second part of Susan Atkins' early testimonies. Substantially identical to her statements to her attorneys, there are some slight differences in the grand jury testimony. For example, Bugliosi didn't ask Atkins if she recalled that Frykowski had been shot, something he had been, but that she didn't recollect when talking to her attorneys. And then Atkins made this comment about being in the Cielo Drive residence during the murders. I remember being in the house, going back, being at the Tate house. I recall either hearing 12 chimes or seeing a clock that said 12. This statement is corroborated by the fact that there was indeed a clock visible on the mantelpiece in the living room of 10,050 Cielo Drive. And those are about the only differences between the two testimonies with regard to the night of August 8-9, 1969, which is the night we're looking at here. So let's recap critically. Atkins' recollection of the wire cutting is likely true. The wires were cut, likely before the homicides, by someone who would have to stand on something like a car hood to get high enough to begin climbing the pole, and who would have to have a somewhat large pair of bolt cutters handy, like in a car. Atkins' recollection of the car being parked at the bottom of the Cielo Drive cul-de-sac is likely true because no one in law enforcement even imagined that possible location for the car, and there is no reason for it to be important that the car was parked at the bottom as opposed to anywhere else. Atkins' recollection of she and her crime partners climbing over the fence to enter the 10,050 Cielo Drive property is likely true because there is no reason for her to have said they didn't enter the property normally through the gate, no matter what motivation you assign to the killers. Also, the physical area by the gate matches the circumstances of what Atkins says occurred there. Atkins' recollection of the shooting of Stephen Parent is likely true, not because of how she describes the shooting itself, but rather because of how she describes Charles Watson pushing Parent's car back out of the way of the gate. No one in law enforcement had any idea or apparent caring how Parent's car got in the position it was in, so it is improbable that anyone would have suggested the scenario she described to explain its location. The only explanation for her recollection is that she indeed saw it happen. Atkins' recollection of Charles Watson entering the Polanski residence through the dining room window and opening the front door for his crime partners is likely true because there are police photographs of the slit screen and open window. Also, there was no mention in the media or even a police report that the window was the entry point, so Atkins couldn't have been prompted from either of those two sources. Now, you could say that the open window was staged by police, but then they would have to have known the real means of entry, presumably the front door, and had a reason for that means to be covered up early enough in the investigation that Wojciech Frykowski's body was still on the front lawn when the staged window picture was taken. That's some fast cover-up work. Atkins' recollection of the position of Sharon Tate Polanski and Jay Sebring's bodies is corroborated by the liver mortis evidence from the autopsy reports that show that the position of the bodies in the crime scene photos is the position those bodies were in no longer than 20 minutes after the victim's heart stopped beating, which is the time frame in which Atkins would have seen them on August 9th. Now, you could say that someone showed Atkins death scene photos previous to her interview with Caruso and Caballero, but then you would have to identify who those persons were and show that they had access to the death scene photos. Otherwise, there is no evidence that that occurred, and claims made without evidence or attribution can be refuted without evidence or attribution. You could also say that the autopsy reports are forged, but if so, someone in the coroner's office would have had to have known why and how to alter the livor mortis notations to fit some false narrative of the crime, and he would have had to know how to do it the day after the bodies were discovered. That's more fast cover-up work. Atkins' recollection of Wojciech Frykowski running out the front door screaming really loud is likely true because those screams were heard by the counselor at the camp out at the girls' school. And Frykowski screaming really loud is consistent with the fact that he was being brutally murdered. Atkins' recollection of Charles Watson beating Frykowski over the head with a gun butt until the grip broke is consistent with parts of the grip being found in the area of the house where the beating was described as occurring, and the fact that Frykowski had head wounds consistent with such a beating. Therefore, her recollection is likely true. Atkins not taking attorney Paul Caruso's bait and agreeing that Wojciech Frykowski had been shot and instead insisting that she didn't remember is evidence of her not being able to be coached and of her being honest in her recollection. Atkins' recollection of Charles Watson stabbing Abigail Folger in the stomach is corroborated by the autopsy report showing Abigail Folger being stabbed in the stomach. Atkins' non-recollection about the position of Wojciech Frykowski's pants is consistent with the position of those pants having no relevance to anything. Atkins' recollection of Charles Watson stabbing Sharon Tate Polanski in the heart is corroborated by the autopsy report showing Sharon Tate Polanski being stabbed in the heart. Atkins not taking attorney Caballero's bait and agreeing that she might have dropped a Buck brand knife at the crime scene and instead insisting that she didn't remember is again evidence of her not being susceptible to being coached and of her being honest in her recollection. Atkins' recollection of her party's encounter with Rudolph Weber was confirmed by Weber himself, with both Atkins and he telling nearly identical accounts. Now, you could say that Rudolph Weber was a liar who the prosecution got to corroborate Atkins' story, but if that were the case, they would have to find a cooperative person willing to lie who also happened to live on a side street on the killer's route home and had a hose visible from the street even on a dark night. Soliciting such a person would be a complicated and risky endeavor for someone perpetrating a massive cover-up requiring absolute secrecy. Atkins' recollection of hearing or seeing a clock indicating midnight during the murders in the Polanski residence is at least possibly true because of the presence of a clock on the mantelpiece in the living room that night. All of the above points to Susan Atkins' early testimonies being true. There are other things about it, such as Atkins apparently misremembering the order of events on the ride back to Spont's ranch after the murders, or the location of a gas station, that don't seem to make sense, but by and large, her testimony is believable. Except for one thing. One thing about the physical evidence at the Polanski residence that not only does not corroborate Susan Atkins' early testimonies, but in fact contradicts them, is that although she says that Sharon Tate Polanski and Jay Sebring were never near the front door area, large pools of blood of their types were found there by investigating officers. What does this suggest? Why doesn't Susan Atkins' testimony match that evidence? Could it be an indication of an alternative crime scenario that is completely different than the standard narrative? There can be any number of reasons for this irregularity, including conspiracy and cover-ups, sloppy gathering of blood evidence at the crime scene, or lab mix-up. But it is beyond the scope of this episode to delve deeply into this only bit of evidence that doesn't jibe with Susan Atkins' recollections. Because otherwise, that glaring exception aside, the early testimonies of Susan Atkins are in large part supported by the physical evidence at the Cielo Drive crime scene, and therefore they would appear to be honest and true. This has been the Goodbye Helter Skelter podcast, the podcast dedicated to the truth about the Tate LaBianca murders, Charles Manson, and more. The views expressed on this program are solely those of the individual speakers, and they do not necessarily represent the thoughts, ideas, or opinions of any other persons, either living or dead. Visit our companion website at www.goodbyehelterskelter.com. There you can find more information about this podcast. Also, check out the Goodbye Helter Skelter Facebook page for information on upcoming programs. And let us know what you think. by way of contact@goodbyehelterskelter.com. We will address any comments, questions, or concerns on future installments of the Goodbye Helter Skelter podcast.